filming.
Are you ready?
Welcome, Dawn. Thank you so much for being a part of our Shakespeare in Canada Symposium and panel through York University in collaboration with Why Not. It's been a huge honor and joy to be able to collaborate with you over the last 5 years on Prince Hamlet. And I'm excited to catch this chance today at the end of these 5 years to have this conversation around Shakespeare and your life as a theatre artist. Just to start us off, would you mind introducing yourself and the role that you play in Prince Hamlet?
First, I want to say, Jeff, thank you for having me. It is a thrill to have the opportunity to offer my perspective as a deaf artist. I think that as deaf artists, our perspective is quite unique and different from that of hearing artists, and I always enjoy the opportunity to share and exchange. And it's a rare opportunity that we can have this kind of relationship that we've had over the last 5 years. Often people come and go, and I think there's difference when there's a sustained relationship. I think it can build more deeply in terms of mutual understanding and awareness than when you're working on a project where people change, come and go. So you begin to build something, and it's good because you get fresh perspectives, but also sometimes, it's good to have the new perspective, and sometimes it's good to have the long-term sustained. So thank you for this opportunity. It's been a joy. So, introducing myself. My name is Dawn Jani Birley, and I was born and raised as a deaf individual. I identify as culturally and linguistically deaf. I come from a third-generation deaf family. My dream to become a deaf actor, I am really, really grateful for having had that opportunity, but I should say it hasn't been easy. There's been many challenges that stem from systemic barriers. And I think that that's a really good reason why I feel I need to continue in this profession to address those.
Thank you, Dawn. You are an inspiration for us all. To start us off, how would you describe your relationship with Shakespeare?
Wow, it's a good question. When I have to answer it, I have to go back to high school. I was very fortunate that I had an extraordinarily talented English teacher. Paulette Hubbs was her name, and I remember her well in high school. Much depends, of course, on the course you're taking and the year that you're in, but I was very fortunate to have Paulette for 3 of my 4 years in high school. And her area of specialization and passion was Shakespeare. She made us read a lot of Shakespeare. I remember in grade 9, grade 10, and grade 12, I had her, and it wasn't just Shakespeare, but the way that she was able to put it in context of his life, what was happening in the world at the time, really engaged us and created a great interest in him and the plays and literature. So again, as an ASL user, English is my second language. So perhaps the impact was less on me than it would have been on somebody who had English as a first language, but I didn't realize until much, much later just how much it had impacted me. So for example, reading in Shakespearean text alongside a modern translation, a modern English translation that explained some of the vocabulary, some of the metaphors, my teacher was able to use those tools to make Shakespeare really, really engaging. And so I thought, oh, well, that's interesting, okay? I like Shakespeare, and that's the end of it. But during my training as an actor, of course, we touched on some Shakespeare plays, but really, typically, Shakespeare is more commonly found in hearing theater than in deaf theater. we have our own literature, our own history. So of course we intersected it with some, exposure to Shakespeare, but typically what we're doing is when we do that, we're looking at the language and thinking, how do we translate that into sign language? Because I live in Scandinavia, I sign in Swedish Sign Language, Norwegian Sign Language, and Finnish Sign Language, and so translation is always top of mind. So I think, how do we convey not just the literal meaning, but the cultural meaning? How do we express it? And of course, it's not the same in each language. So sometimes I'm thinking, obviously Shakespeare is English, so we think, how do we convey that in a language which is not English? And sometimes the translation seems, I guess it conveys a subjective perspective that is interesting to look at. So English is my second language, ASL is my first. So again, I'm looking at, how do we understand the text? And for me, I'm always thinking of the text. So fast forward to Prince Hamlet, when Ravi invited me to be part of this process. And honestly, when I started, I had no idea what we had gotten ourselves into. I really didn't. It was only when we, I discovered this play by accident. We discovered this by accident. It was a process of stumbling through it. And I challenged myself as I was thinking about how hearing people respond to the musicality, poetry, and language of Shakespeare. I think that is an experience that I want to offer deaf people, but visually. I wanted an equivalent experience, and to get there was a very difficult and challenging process. But I was fortunate in that I had some background in Shakespeare, which definitely helped me as I approached this. And it was interesting to me, as I think of hearing people, when you read the script, the text is there. And of course the delivery is different, but you can actually deliver the lines without fully understanding them, which is not something which is available to me, because I have to translate it before I can deliver it, and I have to understand it before I can translate it. And so sign language can offer the opportunity to deliver a text directly, indirectly, in first person, in third person, in metaphor, with abstraction or with less abstraction. So the range is available there, and those are decisions that we have to make. And I think that there are many opportunities in sign language that aren't available in spoken language. So the whole translation process was yet another layer of challenge. So in order to do this, I spent a lot of time talking with Ravi, how he wanted, as director, this text to be conveyed. And as it happens, I am an actor, but I also have a lot of, expertise in translation. And so I think of translation as my playground. I love to challenge myself, to make discoveries, to think about all the various meanings of a word. And as somebody born and raised culturally deaf, I can think, how can I convey that? And in theater in general, it's important to know that it's not accessible for deaf people. Many of us just don't go to the theater because it's not, in a language or a culture that is accessible to us. So communication access is always the number one barrier for deaf people. Communication access to everything that's going on in the world. So we don't go to theater. Growing up, I didn't go to the theater. I had an interest in acting, but I was confronted with a lot of barriers, people denying me opportunities because I was deaf. And so my opportunity to engage with Shakespeare and to put it out there has given deaf people the opportunity to be exposed to Shakespeare in a way that they never would have before. So during the process of Prince Hamlet, I thought that I was really paying attention to the deaf audience, that it was a deaf audience that was my audience. And I was surprised to discover through feedback that it was the hearing audience as well who really appreciated seeing our language on stage, seeing the contribution, the benefit, the positive contribution that having ASL represented was there not just for the deaf audience, but for both audiences. So that was really exciting to me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dawn, for that wonderful answer. It always is so striking to consider something that Ravi's spoken a few times on panels or other things around how in this play Horatio is deaf, and that the entire story comes from that perspective, and the way that then you embrace it in your translation and culture, it's just such a gift for audiences to reconsider Hamlet in this way. You've already touched a little bit upon this, but I'm really curious, from your perspective, the role of Shakespeare in Canadian theatrical culture, hearing or deaf culture. It's a huge question, I know, but I think you would have such a unique perspective on
Hmm. Well, so before I answer, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean, Jeff? I mean, maybe, yeah, I think I know what you're getting at, but can you expand on the question a little bit?
Totally. We have Stratford in, Ontario, and every province in this country has some form of Shakespeare in the park, or there's a predominance of Shakespeare that I believe we've inherited from our British traditions. And it's dominant in a way that I'm clearly biased or have knowledge about, being in this Ontario culture of theatre. But for you, it's so unique because you both come from an international perspective as well, of works that speak outside of classical European works. So when you come here, I'm just really curious what your perspective on Shakespeare's identity is in Canada.
Thanks, Jeff. Now I understand where you're coming from. To be honest, when I look at theatre in Canada, just in general, it's for hearing people, to start with. It's not accessible to us as deaf people. Sometimes they put an interpreter on the stage, or a deaf interpreter on the stage, but that's not the same as experience that a hearing audience would have. So when I look at theatre across Canada and I add Shakespeare to that picture, most of the time I would say, and what I'm speaking of is my awareness before Prince Hamlet, most of the time I would say it's white. It's a white male privileged perspective that we're getting in many of these productions. And it seems to me that it's somewhat rarefied. It is, you can't change it. There is an honoring of the text that makes it untouchable. And yet from my training, my upbringing, my experience, and from an artistic perspective as well, I feel that we're looking at this and I have to question, who says so? Who says we can't touch it? It's true. Okay, so people say Shakespeare is timeless and it's complex. And I think that some of the texts, are not talking about many of the things that are dominant in our conversation, race and other things, but I think, okay, it's not about that. For me, Shakespeare touches on something that is a human emotion, regardless of where we find ourselves, where we're from, and I think that, or what language we speak, where we are in the world. I think that there is an underlying humanity, and it is in our emotional world. What does it mean to be human? And I think that some of those themes are evident. And of course, Shakespeare is playing with language, and you got metaphor, and it's open to many different interpretations, and we can bring those lenses to it. And I think what that provides us with is an opportunity for us to share those interpretations, to look differently at the same text, and create artistic opportunities within that text. I think that people seem sometimes to be able to be more open in their hearts and their minds through the power of art. And so instead of limiting ourselves, we can use these texts as an opportunity to stretch our understanding. What does it mean to us, collectively and individually? What does it mean to us? And after Prince Hamlet, I think I realized that in my world, well, if I go back to the story, in the story, Hamlet charges Horatio with telling the story. So it meant that I had to look closely at the story, and I had to think, what's happening in this Hamlet world? What happens in my world? And what can I bring from my world into the telling of this story? So that the audiences who come to see this show might also see themselves. So, this world could be real because it reflects a real experience. And I think that art gives us the space to have those explorations and to share those realities.
Thank you. You're so excellent because you keep on giving the perfect bridge to the exact next question. As you touch upon Horatio, I'm really curious, now that we've done it, 3 different remounts, what sort of preparation has really helped you from the very beginning back in 2017, and what sort of preparation did you do to come back to this American tour, for example?
So if we go back to 2017, again, we didn't know what we were doing. We had no idea. We had a 6-week rehearsal period, and the idea at the beginning was that we need to figure out how we were going to do this. Ravi's original idea of having a deaf Horatio just wasn't going to work because it wasn't integrated enough. So we had to think, how are we going to focus on how do we do this? At the same time, I had to do a lot of translation. So it wasn't until the 5th week, I think, that we discovered, everything clicked. This was how we were going to do it. And that was when I had to suddenly go about doing a lot of translation to get ready for this way that we were going to enter this. And so the translation, at the same time, all of the other actors were doing their lines, learning the signs, and I think what we came up with was good. I think it was good, Jeff. And then in 2019, we're like, let's do this again. And I knew that the translation needed more work, it needed more depth, it needed to be more rich. So the 2019 translation, I had more time to focus on the translation. So that was a lot of my work. And I asked the interpreters who were working with us to monitor what I was doing, my translation in ASL, and the hearing actors' lines and their delivery, because the interpreters had access to both languages. And so I wanted to make sure that what I was doing was accurately reflecting the English that was on the stage. And then once we had that, absolutely, we can play. I wanted to challenge myself to enhance the richness of the translation. So the hearing cast, I think, were more aware in 2019 of deaf culture. More people were learning how to sign since the 2017 production, and that gave me an opportunity to enhance the amount of sign language that they were producing as part of the production. 2017, it was quite simple. 2019, we were able to go more deep, more complex in the way that ASL was being produced by everybody on the stage. So it was a huge improvement. And then 2022, here we are, we're going to do it again. And it was very interesting to see how different it was. There were some things that were same and some things that were significantly different. So the new cast members didn't have the foundation, the background information, didn't really, I think, understand the role of signing in the play. They didn't understand deaf culture, and it takes time. It always takes time For hearing people, when it's their first time to work with somebody deaf, it always is challenging and it always takes time. It's not challenging for us. We've been through this a long time. But for hearing people, this is a new world, a new language, a new culture, and I commend people for their courage in diving into it. But I know it takes time. So for me, I also was looking at the script, the play that we did in 2017 and again in 2019. I had some time, but again, I was revisiting the translation, and the first two were with the same cast, but 2022 with the new cast members, I think their take on the text was different. And that impacted my translation in ways that I hadn't expected. So I couldn't just use the same translation. For some people I could, for some lines I could, but I couldn't just use the old translation. I had to adapt it for the new delivery of the new cast members because we were building something new and creating new relationships. And at the same time, these are their lines that I'm delivering. Often in the play, I'm delivering their lines. Horatio is telling the story, but in that storytelling, this is their scene. It's their understanding, it's their delivery of the text that I'm aiming to replicate. So that required some, adjustments. I have a metaphor of soup. 2017, we had a very thin, watery soup. 2019, we had a little more thick kind of stew. And 2022 was a creamy, delicious soup. So for me, it has to do with how the translation, the way that ASL is there, the whole thing has developed. And the more time that we look at that Shakespearean text, the more I realize what is there, the more I understand, multiple meanings of lines, not at face value, and how those lines and those possible meanings are expressed depend on who's saying them, how they're saying them, the relationships that have been forged within this group. So it was fascinating to discover that, to develop over the times that we mounted this.
It's incredible to watch you adopt these new translations for some of the new castmates and really reflect the new characters that they're playing. It's an entirely new relationship, as you're suggesting. I was always curious to ask you, Dawn, how did you come to hone in on how to interpret an hearing actor's take on a character and embed that into your translation? What's that process like for you?
It's a good question, Jack. To go back, when we first encountered the new cast, as a deaf person, and because what it means to be a deaf person in a hearing space, I have no access to the sound that is going on around me in the rehearsal space. So my observation is 100% visual. So I attend very carefully visually, and that's not new, that's not just in rehearsal, that's my life. Deaf people are visual people. We attend to the visuals around us and the vibrations around us. That's how I exist in the world, that's how I experience the world. So when I take that way of experiencing the world and put it into my work, I'm attending very carefully to movement, to expression. It's a little hard to explain, but I think when you're hearing something, and hearing is your dominant way of experiencing the world, then it causes you to overlook many other realities in the space. And I think this has come from my experience talking with many hearing people, that the things that are overlooked because of their reliance on the auditory signal. And I don't have that auditory signal, and so I pick up on many, many visual cues. So if something is a little bit different, I pick up on it immediately. It just becomes intuitive. And I think that as deaf people, our intuition is very strong. We rely on it. We rely on that intuition, instinct and intuition, We can talk about the difference between those two things, but in any case, my reliance on that is very strong because I don't have access to the spoken language that is being used in the space. I trust my visual instincts. And it may be that hearing people are surprised, but how they deliver a line will impact how their bodies move in that delivery. So I observe how they're moving. Also, we had conversations. If you remember, we had a conversation where I met with each of the cast members, and I said, if your character was an animal, what animal would it be? Would they be? And that helps me because it gives me a kind of a sense of how that would affect the movement. So I would also try and emulate your movement. As you are delivering your lines, there would be something in your movement that I would take on, that I would reflect how you were delivering it, and that image of an animal also helped me to embody how that delivery would come across. So I think it's an actor's work to analyze movement and text. I think that's what we do to find the meaning that is created when we put movement and text together. And so that's certainly part of the work of deaf actors in sign language theater. That's what we do all the time. When we're doing it in a mixed cast, I think it creates a different process. Now in this cast, I was the only deaf person working with an all-hearing cast, otherwise all-hearing cast. And so we really need to search for balance, and it's hard. It's hard to find balance. But at the same time, there's beauty in that. Yeah.
Thank you. Something that was also so unique and powerful about your translation is that there are times where you also take from Shakespeare's word and add commentary or insight that is just for the hearing audiences. It's almost like an adapter's work, like you did a bit of an adaptation on top of Ravi's remix. I was wondering, when were those moments in the play that you decided to offer that commentary or insight? What led you to those choices for those specific moments? For example, it reminds me of with Polonius when you say, oh, this old man speaks a lot or he's a fool. What offered those instincts to you?
That goes back to 2017, because at that time we were under significant constriction in terms of time. We didn't know how we were doing this, and I realized that just my lines that I was given were not enough to convey the story to a deaf audience. That's when Ravi started with these summaries. So in 2017, I wasn't signing the whole play. I don't know if you remember, Jeff. If we go back to 2017, there was a lot of conversation. There was a lot of what I call dead air, where I sign a little bit and then there's a lot of talking on the stage and then I'll jump up and sign a little bit more. So for a deaf audience, there was a lot of dead air. And that became very uncomfortable to me. When people are talking too long, you can only begin to feel uncomfortable imagining what it is they're saying. So in 2019, that's where we started to find the balance. So the gaps, the voids in 2017, the dead air, became those summaries that we added to try and convey what was happening on the stage actually continued on. They were sort of legacy pieces that carried through in subsequent productions. So some of those were carried over into the 2019. But in the 2019, my translation improved. There was less dead air. There were fewer gaps and voids, but those summaries continued into 2022. And honestly, sometimes there was, in 2022, I think there was almost no dead air because we expanded it so much. So this time, people who had seen the show in each iteration responded with so much enthusiasm about how rich and fulsome it was in the interpretation. So sometimes it made me wonder, what was the role of those summaries? Should we take them out? Because we've so much expanded on the translations. But again, that's a directorial decision. For me, I thought also it makes sense because when you're reading, say you're reading a fairy tale, there are little moments that kind of are summing up where we are in the story, right? There may be, some little moments that are entering into third person or, describe what's been happening in the action. And so it feels appropriate to me that those sometimes exist. And I think that those are also moments where the hearing audience is left out. The hearing audience doesn't get the information. And I feel like that provides an ironic twist sometimes to the experience, to make hearing people feel a little uncomfortable. And I think that even just that experience has a profound impact on audiences.
Absolutely. The only word I can think of in this moment is it's mind expanding for a hearing audience. And I hope heart opening too. What is your favorite aspect of this production?
Ooh. Wow, okay. My favorite aspect of this. Do you mean my favorite scene?
Favorite anything.
Well, what my favorite part of this show is that it is for both worlds. So many times productions are made by hearing people and you may throw an interpreter on the stage, but deaf audiences don't get the same experience that hearing people might think that that's accessible, but it really isn't. It's just a different experience that deaf audiences are having. And sometimes, let me go back. So in Hamlet, what's funny is that deaf people would say, well, what about the interpreter? And I said, no, you don't need an interpreter for this show. And hearing audiences would say, a deaf Horatio? How is that going to happen? So from both audiences, there was skepticism. And I just had to say, come and see it, and then you'll know. And so my favorite part is that we had deaf and hearing members of the audience experiencing the show together. And that has actually led me to establish my company 1S1 because I want there to be more of that exchange where we appreciate theater together. And in Hamlet, it's funny, it surprised me. Sometimes Ravi surprised me because he would ask, he would say, okay, he'd say, make something. Remember, Ophelia's drowning. Okay. So, when he challenged me to do something with that scene, I thought, he asked me to do something that wasn't in sign. And I'm like, why would I not sign it? But I thought, okay, take the challenge. This scene is going to be poetic and visual, not represented linguistically. And it happens that is one of the most impactful scenes for both deaf and hearing audiences. And to me, it makes me think sometimes the less talking, the better, right? The less language, maybe the more power is in something. It gives us a different kind of access to emotion, a different kind of access to feeling. Whatever language you speak and your identity in the world, we have that emotion and it can be embodied, right? We have our hearts beat the same way. And so I feel that is a really powerful scene. And when Ravi challenged me to also create the sword fight scene at the end, he said, can you do something? Do something with your hands, Dawn. Make it look like a sword fight. Do something with your hands. I'm like, I have no idea what you want, Ravi. And then I thought, okay, how do I do this? How can I do something with my hands? How can I create? I mean, a sword fight, we're enacting this, and so my hands became the swords, and then I played with it and expanded it. But I thought, it is something visual. In accepting the challenge to create something creates those really powerful scenes in the play.
Thank you. Yeah, I will never forget that day up in our small little rehearsal space in 2017. It was so small, remember? And then you offered that take of Ophelia, and Ravi was like, oh my god, this is it. And then he was just like, what is Jeff gonna do? And I was just like, I'll walk. And so I remember that first time where I just walked behind you to my death. It was just, it's one of my favorite scenes to do as well, and I don't speak at all.
And I never see your walk.
I've never seen your signing. I see it from the corner of my eye, and I have to wait to pace my walking, and I wait until the bubbles, yeah.
Oh, it's so funny. I know you're behind me, I know you're doing it, I'm signing my thing. It wasn't until I watched the video that I really felt the power of your presence in that scene behind me as I told the story. Like, the image of it is powerful to see us together doing that scene. And I think I really believe that if it was just me signing there, it wouldn't have the power. It's having us together, the pacing of the walk as I'm signing. I just think that connection between us is, it gives goosebumps, I really believe, to see that together. And that's Ravi, right? That's Ravi.
That's Ravi, and that's also what the beautiful, beautiful translation you offer in that moment. I remember in one of the rehearsals, I think in 2022, you also brought it back up to me that in Hamlet, Queen Gertrude is like, Horatio, take care of Ophelia. And that's where I learned as Ophelia, some of the signing for the scene that I have in Act 2. And so that connection of the death always had an extra emotional resonance for me, knowing that you were there to, talk about her death. Anyway, that's just one moment of so many translations that you do that are just stunning. Yeah.
And also, it's, the history that I can offer as a deaf perspective. When you mentioned that about, Horatio being charged with taking care of Ophelia in the original, I think that requires signs. And it's interesting, historically, women have tended to learn sign more than men. I think, just 1 second for the interpretation. I think that, there may be some men who are particularly interested in language and they might, choose to learn sign language. But if you, look at hearing people who learn sign, for example, look at the interpreting profession. It's like 80% female. So, that's one just demonstration of it. But historically, that seems to be the case. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is about sort of language learning and cognition, but that historically is the case. So when I think of that reality and I think of the characters in the play, I think that Ophelia signing, especially in her madness, I think that the signing comes out in her madness because another piece of history is around some research that demonstrates that people experiencing mental illness can sometimes communicate more effectively in ASL. Now this is, historically people were misunderstood. People misunderstood deafness and the use of sign language as a cognitive disorder, a problem, a developmental disorder. People were institutionalized because of it, but also in the impact of language, spoken language that can come about through mental illness doesn't impact sign language in the same way. So there's a clarity in signing that wouldn't be in the spoken language. So what that means is people who are, for example, hospitalized, that sometimes incorrectly diagnosed because they're signing and people didn't understand that as sign, but perceived it as mental illness. So there's all of these connections between mental illness and sign language that come from our history, and it was really interesting to see that play out in Ophelia's character.
Thank you. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this interview?
So, yes, Prince Hamlet as a show is a bilingual production. But at the same time, I think it's important to examine who's in the story, who's in the cast. You know, we've talked about, you know, Shakespeare as being predominantly, you know, coming and enacted in, you know, white spaces that are very white. What does that mean? What does it entail? What does it restrict? What does it remind us of? And how do we take on that challenge? And I think, okay, so, you know, my experience of the world is all I know, but it's only one way of seeing things. And so we need to constantly be reminded to make space for other ways of seeing things. And what we can learn from one another and other perspectives that can enhance our lives. And I think that this production speaks volumes in many, many different ways. Not just the bilingual nature of it, but the gender casting, the racial casting choices that were made. I think all of it points to a collective humanity that transcends some of our differences. By looking at the differences, we can also see our shared humanity.
That is a beautiful call to action. And a perfect way to end this interview. Thank you so much, Dawn, for your time. And thank you so much for these incredible 5 years of collaboration. I have learned so much working with you on Prince Hamlet. I can't wait for more through 1S1.
And thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving space to share this. We've had challenges. Sometimes, you know, hearing and deaf people working together creates challenge because we come from sometimes very opposite worlds, and communication is a challenge always. But when hearing people give us space, I think we you know, can build bridges, right? The bridge building has to happen both ways, and when it does, I think it leads to extraordinary potential for change. It's been such a joy working with you, and you know, working with you on Prince Hamlet, and I think that 1S1 has more exciting surprises in store.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.